Pelusium was an ancient Egyptian city situated near the Mediterranean coast on the eastern end of the Nile Delta, possibly founded during Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Due to its location, it was often a target of Egypt's enemies, and as such was heavily fortified. But in 541, an invader managed to slip through the gates. A very tiny invader. One that no one was looking for. But one that would be extremely deadly. The invader is now known to have been Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that causes bubonic plague. There are multiple theories on Yersinia pestis' origin. One states that it came from the Great Steppe, and another places it in northern India near the base of the Himalayas. It may have been born in either of those places and spread, but prior to 541, never encountered the right combination of factors that would lead to a massive spread among humans. At some point, it landed in Central Eastern Africa, near the African Great Lakes and the source of the Nile River. Whether it originated here, or simply came here by other means, is still up for debate. Yersinia pestis lives in the digestive system of small rodents, rats being the preferred home. It would spread through contact with fleas. The flea would bite an infected rat, and Yersinia pestis would live for a short time inside the flea, sometimes causing the blood to coagulate at the entrance of the insect's stomach. The flea would then continue to bite the rat, hoping to feast on its blood, but it would not get the nourishment since its stomach was inaccessible. So the flea would eat and eat, but would stay hungry. This caused the flea to look for more nourishment, and it would desperately jump to nearby rats or other mammals to find sustenance. It would then bite its new host, and Yersinia pestis would spread, and the cycle would continue like this. It seems obvious that the fleas would make the journey from the south end of the Nile to the north. The elevation in the south is higher, which causes the river to flow northwards towards the Mediterranean. This is also why the southern portion of the Nile is called the Upper Nile, and the northern portion is known as the Lower Nile. Logically, it makes sense that the rats, and with them the fleas, would move from the Great Lakes north towards Egypt fairly easily. But there was one problem. The fleas that carry Yersinia pestis are at their most active in a very limited temperature range, roughly between 59 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. At the same time, the bacterium within the flea tends to cause less coagulation as the temperature climbs into the high 70s Fahrenheit. So this created a sort of northern limit on the spread of the bacterium. As long as the African climate remained consistent, it might have stayed this way for a while. Who knows how long? But in the late 530s, something changed. And the effects would be catastrophic. In 535, the Eastern Roman general Belisarius invaded and conquered Sicily on behalf of Emperor Justinian the Great. Belisarius then moved on to Italy the next year and battled the Ostrogoths while taking their capital, Ravenna, in 540. During this time, the Franks had brought an army into northern Italy as well. The presence of these three armies marching across the peninsula resulted in significant damage to agriculture and to trade. Pacopius, an historian who accompanied Belisarius on his campaign, writes that the armies took food from the locals to keep themselves fed, and that the war itself resulted in fields across Italy being left untended. He also tells us that the food shortages were so bad that 2 women outside Ariminum resorted to cannibalizing 17 men just to survive. Cassiodorus, a Roman bureaucrat at this time, writes of a devastating famine in northern Italy taking place as well. These were clearly desperate times, and the war absolutely played a large part in this. But it was not the only factor. We know this because other sources tell us that other areas far away from the war, also suffered food shortages in the late 530s. Liber Pontificalis, for instance, reports a, quote, heavy famine throughout the whole world, unquote, taking place during this time. The Annals of Ulster mention a, quote, failure of bread, unquote, in Ireland in the late 530s. Additionally, there are reports of crop failures or poor harvests across the Middle East. In China, a frost was reported in July of 537, followed by snow in August. The problem was not confined to Italy. It was a worldwide phenomenon. And the cause can be found in Procopius's description of the spring and summer of 536. And it came about during this year that a most dread portent took place. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. For the beams it shed were not clear, nor such as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war, nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. Cassiodorus confirms this, writing, quote, the sun, first of the stars, seems to have lost his wonted light, and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigor of his heat wasted into feebleness, and the phenomena which accompany a transitory eclipse, prolonged through the whole year. These writers were describing a volcanic winter that took place from 536 to 537. It was the result of a dust cloud in the Earth's atmosphere that blocked sunlight from shining through as it normally would. It was most likely the result of a series of volcanic eruptions, but debris from a meteor or comets passing by in space may have played some kind of role as well. Interestingly, the death of the legendary King Arthur took place somewhere in the late 530s or possibly the early 540s, and is said to have been accompanied by the appearance of a comet. Procopius also mentions a comet, saying, quote, and some called it the swordfish, because it was of goodly length and very sharp at the point, and others called it the bearded star. It was seen for more than 40 days, unquote. Procopius places this comet in 539 and the volcanic winter in 536, but it is possible that there was some kind of connection, especially since the quote-unquote transitory eclipse kicked off what is called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of anywhere from 50 to 125 years in which the average temperatures dropped noticeably across Europe. The sun did return after the volcanic winter, but springs and summers were a couple of degrees cooler for the next century or so. But whatever the cause of the volcanic winter, this event that caused the sun to, quote, give forth its light without brightness, unquote, caused major problems for crops, leading to famine. And it also had a major effect on movement along the Nile. The fleas that carried Yersinia pestis that had been mostly confined to the southern portion of the river were now much more active much further north than they were previously as a result of the cooler temperatures. Suddenly, Yersinia pestis was spreading quickly into a new, broader population of rats. The rat population in northern Africa and across Europe was probably quite a bit higher than normal around this time as well. We know that more precipitation and cooler temperatures can lead to a more ideal environment for rats. And we also know that war can result in a sustained rat population surge. As historian Michael McCormick puts it, quote, "Warfare brings wide fluctuations in rat populations. Such surges stem from disrupted supply networks, individuals' makeshift food hoarding, and degraded housing stock. All of these causes sound plausible in a 6th century that saw the Frankish conquest of southern Gaul, persistent banditry on the Egyptian and African borders, Justinian's reconquest of Africa, Italy, and part of Spain, the wars with Persia, and the appearance of Central Asian and Slavic marauders in the Balkans." Unquote. And then, there's earthquakes. And yes, this matters too. Earthquakes have been correlated to an increase in rat populations, even in modern times. The reason is that earthquakes often damage granaries and other food stores, which gives rats more access to food. And lo and behold, Constantinople was hit with earthquakes in 525, 533, 548, 554, and 557. This makes it very likely that the rodent population in the city was booming at the worst possible time. Combine all these factors. The rat population is surging. Fleas are following suit since they have plenty of hosts. And these fleas can now carry Yersinia pestis, which has made its way up the Nile. But here's the problem. These rats have not been exposed to Yersinia pestis before, so they do not have any natural defenses to the bacterium. These rats cannot fight off the infection, and they stop surviving. But the fleas are still around. Their population begins to exceed the rat population, which causes the fleas, starving and desperate, to look for other mammals to latch onto. And that's when they turn, in large numbers, to Homo sapiens. I'm bringing all this up to show that this really was a perfect storm. All of these factors had to come together for this to happen the way that it did. When this perfect storm crashed head-on into Pelusium in the autumn of 541, the disease engulfed the city and quickly spread overland to nearby Alexandria. The plague ravaged these cities, but remained somewhat localized to the Nile Delta because the winter months were approaching, which limited trade and sea travel. The winter of 541-542 was hell in Pelusium and the surrounding area, but by spring, the worst had seemingly passed, and the citizens, as they did every year, began to prepare shipments for Constantinople and for the rest of Europe. As travel and trade picked back up, the disease quickly spread. It soon hit Gaza, Jerusalem, Damascus, Antioch, and the ports of southern Anatolia. And in the spring of 542, it reached Constantinople. Constantinople was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe in 542. Like Pelusium, it was very defensible. And like Pelusium, in just a few short months, the plague brought the city to its knees. The disease arrived first in the city's docks in the spring of 542, and from there, it spread rapidly, infecting thousands. Procopius says of the infected, quote, "They had a sudden fever, some when just roused from sleep, others when walking about, and others while otherwise engaged, without any regard to what they were doing. And the body showed no change from its previous color, nor was it hot as might be expected when attacked by a fever, nor indeed did any inflammation set in, but the fever was of such a languid sort from its commencement, and up till evening, that neither to the sick themselves nor to a physician who touched them would it afford any suspicion of danger. It was natural, therefore, that not one of those who had contracted the disease expected to die from it. But on the same day in some cases, in others on the following day, and in the rest not many days later, a bubonic swelling developed." Unquote. These swellings, known as the buboes, typically developed in the victim's armpits or behind their ears or in their groin. The swelling would then grow to the size of melons. Occasionally, they would burst, spewing out pus and blood. Some people died quickly from internal hemorrhaging, and they were the lucky ones. Some went into comas and starved to death. Others went insane. Procopius writes that the disease, quote, "ensued with some a deep coma, with others a violent delirium, and in either case they suffered the characteristic symptoms of the disease. For those who were under the spell of the coma forgot all those who were familiar to them, and seemed to be sleeping constantly." Unquote. Still others were, quote, "seized with delirium, suffered from insomnia, and were victims of a distorted imagination, for they suspected that men were coming upon them to destroy them, and they would become excited and rush off in flight, crying out at the top of their voices." Unquote. These cries would echo through the city's streets, with thousands dying daily, while a terrified population could only pray for their own safety and for an end to the madness. As the deaths piled up, the city ran out of space to bury the bodies. Large cemeteries were built on the other side of the Golden Horn as the city and the government struggled to cope with the excess deaths. But even this wasn't enough. Procopius writes that the bodies still piled up and that many were stacked unceremoniously in the defensive towers in Psyche, so much so that a, quote, "evil stench pervaded the city," unquote, especially when the winds blew in from across the Golden Horn. No one could avoid the plague. The dock workers, the merchants, the masons, the bankers, the soldiers, the bureaucrats, the senators, the aristocrats. All were susceptible. The disease even came for the emperor himself. During this time, Justinian became very ill with the disease, yet he would miraculously recover, but not before rumors had spread far and wide that the emperor had died. Across the empire, people were no strangers to the plague, and they likely believed the rumors of Justinian's demise based on the horror that they saw in their own backyards. In 542, the plague reached Illyricum. In 543, there were large outbreaks in Carthage and in Rome. That same year, there were outbreaks in Arles and Marseille, the first known occurrences in Gaul. This wave of the plague lasted until 549, and this period in particular is known as the Justinianic Plague, named obviously for the Roman emperor who nearly succumbed to the disease. But this was only the first wave of a much broader pandemic. Constantinople and Marseille would suffer outbreaks again in 558. In 573, there would be another outbreak in Constantinople. Avignon and Rome would be hit in 590, with the outbreak in the Eternal City taking the life of Pope Pelagius II. The plague hit Ravenna in 591. Antioch again in 592. Nisibis in 599. In the 680s, there were outbreaks in Ireland, Kent, and Northumbria, but also in Chang'an and Luoyang in China. This was the first global pandemic affecting 3 continents and millions of people. It would continue to devastate Europe and North Africa until the middle of the 8th century. According to historian Dionysios Stathakopoulos, during the 210-year span from 541 to 751, there were approximately 18 different major outbreaks of the plague, which averages out to 1 every 11.6 years. There would be significant long-term effects from all of this. In the wake of the plague's first wave, the Roman Empire saw a period of significant instability in imperial coinage, the result of a major decrease in the taxable population. Justinian's bureaucrats had to lean on the wealthy during this time to ensure that revenues did not completely dry up, and Procopius rants against this policy in The Secret History. But even that wasn't enough to sustain spending, and the overall lack of funds forced Justinian to cut back on expenses. Infrastructure suffered significantly as a result. It is a very common belief that Justinian's wars of reconquest left the imperial state in a bad financial position, and that is certainly true. Those wars came with a very high price tag. But we cannot ignore the effect that the plague had as well, decreasing revenues and destabilizing the currency. The plague also resulted in other economic changes. The deaths led to a higher demand for labor, which resulted in a higher demand for wages. Justinian even had to issue an edict freezing prices and pay in an attempt to get the situation under control. In this edict, the emperor whined that the artisans, tradesmen, and agricultural workers were being too greedy with their demands for money. These laborers had more leverage than they had ever known, and they were using it to their advantage, much to the dismay of the aristocracy. And the effects were not limited to Constantinople. A modern analysis of Egyptian leasing records from this time indicates that lease terms became more favorable to tenants starting at around the middle of the 6th century. This trend was likely true in other areas as well, the result of widespread death and depopulation. With that population decline came a lower demand for crops and a smaller labor force cultivating the land. New lands then stopped being cleared for agriculture. But link that back to what I said before about the tradesmen in urban centers demanding higher wages and tenants being able to find better housing. When that happened, the population in the urban centers rebounded faster than the farmers could handle given their labor problems, which led to food shortages and higher demand for crops. The price of arable land itself then quickly increased, and farmers began trying to produce more and more food on the limited land that they already worked. This created a cycle. The population recovered at different rates in different places at different times, all while the plague was still rearing its ugly head every decade, making its own dent in the numbers. The ratio of the general population to the farmable land that had sustained the Roman Empire for centuries was completely thrown out of whack, and that is not something that just recovers overnight. It takes years, or decades, or even centuries for all of that to get sorted out. Western Europe was able to stabilize somewhat quicker than the Eastern Roman Empire, and emerged stronger in the centuries following the plague. From around the late 9th century onwards until the next plague pandemic, the population in Western Europe boomed. Farmers in Gaul and Germania made use of heavy plows and advancements in crop rotations, which had previously been used in China, to produce more food and feed their populations, leading to and helping to sustain their rapid growth in numbers. And, with the Roman Empire significantly weakened by the plague, there was a shift in the European political power centers. In the 540s, Constantinople was the most powerful city in Europe, with the Roman emperor on the throne. After the plague, though, much of Western Europe no longer looked to the Roman emperor in the east, but instead to the Frankish king in the west. In the east, the Sasanian Empire was a major power in 540 and the only true rival to the Romans. But the Sasanians suffered greatly from the plague as well, at least partially as a result of military campaigns against the Romans that brought the disease eastward and into the empire's interior. Ctesiphon was particularly devastated in 627 and 628. Thousands died, including the Sasanian king, Kavad II. The effects of the plague left the Sasanian Empire, as well as the Roman Empire, militarily weakened and made them prime targets for a new emerging threat from the south. Arabia was undergoing its own transformation during this time, but not just from the plague. The Prophet Muhammad was born around 570 in Mecca, and his influence would be immeasurable. Half a century later, his successors ruled over a united Arabian peninsula. We know that the Arabs were affected by the plague, but it does seem like its effect was limited. As the old saying goes, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But there is reason to believe that a few factors might have mitigated the overall devastation of the plague in this region. Arabian cities were sparsely populated compared to their northern brothers. Cities like Alexandria, or Ctesiphon, or Antioch, or Constantinople were far more densely populated than the Arabian cities of this time, and therefore much more susceptible to a quickly spreading plague. And the desert itself served as somewhat of a shield. This goes back to the rats and the fleas. They moved up the Nile and from there into major cities, but it is possible that they didn't move as easily across the vast Arabian desert. Traders and merchants in Arabia also traveled much slower across the desert than their contemporaries who were moving goods across the vast system of roads that the Romans had constructed across Europe and Asia Minor. This all probably helped keep the pandemic away from the major Arabian population centers, or at least kept the spread far more limited than it was in other areas. So now, you had a newly united people that were not crushed to the same degree that their neighbors were. This helped contribute to the rapid Arabian conquest across the Levant, North Africa, and Persia, which ended the Sasanian Empire in 651. Take that last part in. When the pandemic arrived in Pelusium, the Sasanians were a dominant power. A century later, they were completely wiped off the map. The plague itself wasn't the only factor in this, but it was certainly a part of it. The plague was the major event of late antiquity. It played a significant role in shaping what we know as the medieval world. Late antiquity itself is a transitional period, from the ancient world of the Roman emperors and the legions to the medieval world of kings and their knights. And the plague is, I think, a bit of a transitional period within that transitional period. At its onset, we have the Romans and the Persians, but at its end, we have the Franks and the Arabs. The disease, its spread, and its impact all helped drive that transition. From the population shift, to its monetary impact, to its effect on the ability of the major powers to wage war, this tiny bacterium, traveling on a small flea, left a major mark on the world, one that would be felt for centuries.